Today's video is about the evolution of communication signals, again sexual selection, and birds of paradise. But why did I just say all of this and display the slides at the same time? You could also just read the summary or the script I wrote with some pictures and you could get the same info. Or you could just listen to a podcast where I explain everything in audio. So in other words, what's the purpose of multimodality, which is sending information at the same time through different sensory channels? It's relatively common in nature, and that's because it has multiple important purposes, we think. The first is redundancy. In nature, there's noise everywhere, and so if a message doesn't come through on one channel, still get another, which might still have less noise. This principle is actually called degeneracy, because redundancy would be saying the same thing multiple times. Another purpose of multimodality is to convey different messages. That will be, for example, a referee who is blowing the whistle to say that something is happening, and making a gesture to say what that thing is that is happening. A third purpose is memorizability, because many studies have shown that multimodal information is easier and quicker to understand and is memorized easier than unimodal information. I hope this also works with these slides and presentation. So multimodality is good for communication, but sending signals is also costly, so it might not always be worth it. Here we're going to look at the relationship between the signals in the individual modalities and the context of sexual selection. So if one signal becomes really intense, what does that mean for the other signals? In nature, there are examples of all three possibilities. So there is a trade-off between the signals, like in these lizards, where the Prettier species perform fewer and less pronounced push-ups, as you might have seen them do maybe. Another study, which also included that lizard group, has found that there is no correlation between coloration and behavior. In songbirds, though, we often see a positive correlation between plumage, coloration, and song complexity, so just all around sexier birds. I guess you can already see that there are some problems here. So the first one is that we're studying signal complexity, but how do we actually define and quantify that? What seems pretty dull to us might be a super elaborated thing to the animal. So for example, the fish here is just plain yellow to us, but on a UV light that these fish can also sense, that fish has a pretty interesting pattern. The second challenge is that it's very difficult to compare phenotypes, that is, how an organism appears, between species that don't really share a character. For example, how do you compare the size of the crest of this gray crested finch with the redness of this blackbird's beak? So even more impossible than that seems to compare signals across different modalities. For example, is this golden pheasant prettier than this song of a nightingale? The main purpose of the paper I will present here is to present a method of dealing with these issues and giving us some insight into the correlations between different signal modalities and what they possibly mean for the evolution. The title is Evolution of Correlated Complexity in the Radically Different Courtship Signals of Bird of Paradise. Alright, so we're going to look at the beautiful Paradiseidae. They are a really good group to study for this because their looks and courtship behaviors are incredibly diverse, as you might have seen. They are a monophyletic group, so they are all closely related. They all more or less have the same life history and all are fruit eaters. and they are all polygynous, so one male always mates with multiple females, if it can. They also all occur in a relatively small geographic area in the Southeast Asia and Australia area. All of these factors are important here because that means that all these species have roughly similar pressures of natural selection working on them. So most of the vast diversity we see in these birds is probably due to sexual selection acting on the plumage, courtship behavior, and songs, and maybe other modalities as well. The authors of this paper developed a method to characterize the richness and diversity of the plumage, behavior, and song of these birds. For the behavior, they watched videos of the dances and broke them down into subunits, or distinct moves. They then analyzed the complexity over time with the sliding window method. So for every, say, 2 seconds or so, they counted up how many different moves the bird was performing. They used the same sliding window analysis for the songs, where they got the individual elements of the song from an automatic clustering, so that a high whistle would be one element and a click would be another element. To categorize the complexity of the plumage, the researchers quantified how many different colors from the literal bird's eye view the feathers have and how different they are. Then the team took the data and mapped it onto a phylogeny of this clade and used some fancy statistics to see whether a close relationship between two signals that we see is because of similar selection pressures, or it's because those two birds are just really closely related. And here's what they found. This is a plot of the relationship between the acoustic and color diversity. Every dot here represents a species. So this bird up here has a very diverse song and feathers, while this species sings a bit less elaborate, but is super color diverse. The gray lines you see drawn between them is the evolutionary tree just stretched out into this plot. Don't worry about the colors of the points for now. The important part here is that there is a trend line drawn in, which has a positive slope. That means that more acoustically diverse birds have on average also more color diverse plumage. It is also the case that more elaborate songs correlate positively with behavioral diversity. So prettier song means prettier dance. Those two results are in line with the hypothesis that there is no trade-off between these signals and that sexual selection worked on both modalities in the same direction. However, there is no correlation between behavioral diversity and color diversity. So you can see it in this plot by that flat dotted trend line. And that can be explained with the hypothesis that different modalities, or sensory channels, maximize information transfer. And because the behavior and coloration are both visual, it doesn't make much sense to maximize both, and then this bird would be better off honing his or her, his singing skills. Next, the author asked whether the diversity of a signal is correlated with where in the forest the birds live. So some live in the canopy, others in the understory, and still others live on the forest ground. The higher up you go in the forest, the less rich the dances of these species become. The plot tells us that with the blue lines with asterisks at the top. We currently don't have a good explanation for why that might be. Further research is needed. The acoustic richness is higher in the canopy than on the ground, which might be explained by all the clutter on the ground blocking and muffling the sound. The color richness is not significantly different between the forest stories, as you can see by the missing asterisks. I also have to add that the diversity of all three signals is not different between these groups. So we can't really say anything solid about the reason for these relationships we see with the richness. The last factor the team looked at was whether birds were courting one-on-one or in a group, which is also called a lek, or in a group where the individuals can't see each other, which is also called an exploded lek. There is only a difference in color richness, where the lek-forming species are more color-rich than the others. The authors have the hypothesis that it's the color only in the leks, because this modality or the signal is stable within one individual, and it's easier to track than to figure out who just sang what or did that cool move a second ago. So in conclusion, there is positively correlated diversity between modalities, which is probably driven by sexual selection. This correlation means that there is no trade-off between signal channels, but it's difficult to find the trade-offs with other things, like the sensory environment and all kinds of pressures of natural selection. However, methods in this paper were developed to do exactly that, and it gives us good hypotheses and starting points for further research into individual factors. Since this analysis is only correlational, we don't know the mechanism by which females choose their partners and how attractiveness is related to each individual feature. So some problems with this method are also that it only looks at plumage color and not, for example, the length or shape of the ornamental features. And it's also humans that score the acoustic features. But I think it would be better if we could score the song complexity through also a bird model of hearing, similar to what it's done with the coloration, looking at it through a bird's ear hearing. Still, I think this is a great paper and a solid step towards a better understanding of all the evolutionary forces that create all this beauty in the world.